Hello, beautiful InvoiceShelf community. This is yet another tutorial video for us to look at how to install your InvoiceShelf instance on Docker. This variant is going to be of MySQL. Now, just to introduce myself a little bit, because you may not know me, I am the annoying voice behind the caps lock, the moderator on InvoiceShelf server. Hello everyone. Alright, let's get started. So, what we're going to do first is, as per usual, we will go on to the InvoiceShelf.com, from where we will click on the documentation button. So the documentation is basically just your subdomain, which is docs, so docs.invoiceshelf.com. And from there, what we want to do is we want to click on the installation, which is under the Getting Started section. So if we click on that, here we have a choice whether to install a Docker installation, which is what we're going to be doing today, or whether we're going to do a manual or traditional installation. So we will go with the Docker one, so we'll click on Learn More under the Docker. And here we have just a couple of steps to go through in order to install our application. So the first thing that you will of course need to do is install Docker itself. So make sure you do that. I am not going to go through the Docker installation in this video. There's plenty of videos out there on YouTube or even on the internet where you can find the exact installation steps for your system. By the way, in this case, what we're going to be doing is installing and running Docker on Windows. However, the actual Docker engine is going to be running under WSL, that's Windows Subsystem for Linux. And what we're going to be running as a Linux distro is the Ubuntu 2404, which is going to be the actual engine for our Docker. Now, but that's just behind the scenes. Obviously, once you install it on your system, it might be completely different. You might even run it on Windows itself. So, what we're going to do is we're going to install Docker. Once we got the Docker up and running, so in my case, it's already installed. Here it is. What we're going to do is we are going to copy this command over here, which is to clone the repository. So you would need to make sure that you have Git installed on your system if you're using Windows, so it might be something like Git bash. But in my case, because I already have it installed on WSL Linux, I don't need to do that. So we copy the command, we go into the terminal, and in the terminal we change a directory to a place where we want to store it. In my case, because this is just a sample installation, I'm going to cd into my usual git external folder and then inside InvoiceShelf. Because I also maintain InvoiceShelf, I obviously will have the core of the InvoiceShelf, which is the actual application that's running behind the Docker image. So what we will do is we will paste the command, so it will already contain the git clone at the beginning, hit enter, and it will begin the cloning process. Alright, now typically all you would need to do is you would need to go inside the directory itself for the Docker and simply run docker compose, choose the variant, and then do the up command for the compose. However, in this case, there is a slight mistake in the actual Docker compose file for MySQL, which is what we're going to be using. So what we will need to do is we will need to edit the file a little bit. Now, if you're using something like VS Code, it's fairly simple. All you have to do is just open VS Code. In my case, I'll just do it from the command line, and in the code, I will open the actual Docker repository. So if we check over here, here is our Docker repository. You will see that there is Docker Compose for MySQL, Postgres, and SQLite. So what we're going to do is we're going to use MySQL. Therefore, I'm going to open that file. If you're using, if you want to do it through the terminal, it's quite simple. You do nano or vim, whichever you like, and you open that specific file. For the sake of everyone else, I am going to continue with VS Code because this is quite simple. Okay, so the thing that we need to edit in the file is under the InvoiceShelf DB service, we have an environmental variable called MySQL password, and right now, as you can see, it has quotation marks inside of it. what we want to do is we want to remove that if you want to keep the same password, which is SomePass. If you want to use a different password, you can just completely change that. So remove the quotation marks and just type in your password here, and then copy the same password over here under the service of InvoiceShelf itself. Yes, so you will have two instances, one for the database, one for the actual service of InvoiceShelf. So in this case, because this is just an example, I'm going to keep it as is. So it's going to be SomePass. Alright, so once you have added that, you just save the file, and what you can do is you can run the docker compose command. So let me show you exactly what you need to do. So I'm going to return to this terminal over here, so it's nice and simple. So you type in docker compose, and then after that you want to provide a flag for a file. So in this case the flag is -f for a file, and we're going to provide the docker compose. So docker compose in our case is the MySQL. So once you type in docker-compose dot, type in m for MySQL, and you hit tab. Alright, once you've got that, all you need to do is provide the actual compose command, which in this case is up. We're composing up. And after the up command, we want to type in -d, which is the flag for detached session. So essentially what will happen is once it composes the docker compose, instead of running it in the terminal window itself, it will detach that instance and it will just run in the background. It's useful because once you close the terminal, the actual instance will continue running, whereas if you don't have the detach, it will of course run in a terminal for as long as the terminal is open. Once you close the terminal, it will of course close. Alright, so we will run it in a detached mode, so we'll just enter that. So as you can see, it's currently pulling the image information, and once it does that, it will then immediately start running the application. There we go. So it's currently running. So what we want to do now is we want to go into the browser and we want to open a new tab, going to localhost port 90. Okay, so in this case, if you just hit enter, we'll see the setup screen. So you can see it's now saying localhost :90 installation. If you want to change your domain or to enter the actual domain, so if you want to run on a different port or run under an actual domain, what you can do is, before running the docker compose command, this is important. Obviously I already run the command, but in your case you would need to enter that before running the docker compose. If you already run docker compose, you would need to remove the images, remove the containers, and then redo it again after editing the file. But what you need to do is you need to change the value here under the app URL, under the InvoiceShelf service. You need to change the app URL to have your domain. So say for instance domain.tld, and you also need to make sure that you update your sanctum stateful domain. So in this case it's going to be, say for instance, domain.tld. Yes, and the same goes for the session domain. So again, domain.tld. Now sometimes people move to a different domain, or they may move from a domain to a subdomain. Once you have moved the application from a domain to a subdomain in your Nginx and your DNS settings, all you need to do is inside the Docker Compose, you need to add the subdomain or a different domain in these free envars under the InvoiceShelf, right? So you would do something like, say, accounts.domain.tld, or wherever the domain is for you, right? So this is just an example, of course. We're not actually going to do that. I'm going to return it back to the localhost 90. Okay. Obviously, if you wanted to run under a different domain, under a different port, you would change the values here and here. Okay, so we will leave it as it is right now, and I'm going to return to the InvoiceShelf setup screen. So once you're in the InvoiceShelf setup screen, all you do is just click continue until you get to the database setup. Here, because we're using MySQL, we'll keep everything as is. So you've got the app URL, you've got the MySQL selected as the database connector, you've got port 3306, so we'll keep it as such. If you're using something like Postgres or SQLite, you obviously will choose that from the drop down. Okay, so now we need the database name, username, password, and we will also need to change the host. To do that, what we will do is we will take the values from within the environmental variables. However, if you check the actual documentation, you will see that in step 4, sorry, I actually skipped a bunch of steps. So in step 3, we prepared the Docker Compose, so that's what we did with the fix. Step 4 is where we finalize and run the Docker Compose. So again, you've got your Docker Compose app D. Obviously, the actual compose file has been amended from this command. I will update the documentation to reflect that. But in this case, obviously, if you run it as Docker Compose app, it means that you probably have removed the MySQL from the file, so it's just Docker Compose YAML. In our case, we run it with the F flag, so we provided the specific compose file that we wanted to run. So we are currently at step 5, whereas we are completing the installation wizard. So if you have a look, for MySQL and Postgres, we're sharing the common host name. Oh, actually, the host is wrong, so that would need to be updated as well. But I will go through those steps with you in this video. So the database name, the username, and the password are correct in the documentation, so we'll use those. But if you're ever unsure about what to use as the values, you can always just check with the environment variables in your Docker Compose file of choice. So in our case, MySQL. If you have a look, you've got DB database, which is InvoiceShelf, that's our database name, DB username, that's the username for the database, and DB password, which is the password for our database. So we'll just choose those. So in our case, the database name is InvoiceShelf, and the username is InvoiceShelf, so we'll use those. So database name InvoiceShelf, and database username is InvoiceShelf. The password in our case is SUMPass. I'm keeping it as the default, so I'll choose that. And then for the database host, we're going to use the service name for the database. So the service name for the database is actually InvoiceShelf DB, so we'll use that to actually connect to the database, not the default value, which is localhost. Yeah, so 127.0.0.1, which is equivalent to localhost. Alright, so we're going to replace that with InvoiceShelf_DB. And the next step is quite important. If you have an installation which already has a database and it has some data inside of it, if you don't care about that data, and that's important, if you don't need the data that's inside that database, you can then override, you can check this check mark over here, which says override existing data and proceed. In most cases, if you already have data, you probably don't want to lose that. There is going to be a separate video to show you how to bypass this requirement over here. But if you have data and you don't care for it, you can then obviously check the checkbox. In our case, this is a brand new database, so we don't need it. But again, if you have data and you don't care for it, you choose that checkmark. Alright, so click on Save and Continue. It will now set up the database. Alright, so the database has been configured. The next step, we will do the domain verification. So in this case, it has already detected that we're running under localhost 90. So we will keep it as is. In your case, you might be running under a different domain if you chose to enter a custom domain in the compose file. But in our case, we're of course using localhost port 90. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to verify now. that of course succeeded. So the next step for us is to set up the mail. So here, bog standard, I'm not going to go through that. If you have the SMTP or SendMail or Mailgun or SES, any of those services, you can of course use those. In this case, because this is just an example, I'm going to use Simple Mail, and I'm going to add some default values, or well, not default, fake values. Okay, so we're going to save that. Next step is for you to set up your profile. So in my case, I'll put my real name, which is Richard, and my email, it's going to be fake, so InvoiceShelf@invoiceshelf.com. The password is going to be super secure 1234567 because the minimum length for the password is 8 characters, so I'm just going to have that. Okay, we're going to save that. Next, we set up the company information. So in this case, I'm just going to use Consoto. All right, and it will be in the United States, so we'll keep everything else as is. Save that. Now this is important. Under company preferences, which is the next step, you need to make sure that you choose the currency correctly. So if you don't choose the company currency correctly, you will have to reset up a new company later on. So make sure that you choose the currency that it's applicable to you. Otherwise, later on you won't be able to change that. It will be said once we click on the save button. So you will be aware of it when you go through this setup. Alright, so we're going to keep everything as is. I'm going to click save. As you can see, we have a warning to say that the company's currency cannot be changed later, so you do need to make sure that you have the correct one. So we click OK, and that's it. You've got InvoiceShelf up and running. So I hope you found this video useful, and I hope you have a great day. Take care.